She wasn't supposed to matter, just a 12-year-old girl, walking alone through the dusty alleys of Elm Ridge, clutching a bag of leftover bread and the leash of a stray German shepherd with torn ears and tired eyes. No one noticed her. No one knew her name. Until that night, when a single scream, a flickering flashlight, and the growl of a dog changed everything. What she found wasn't a wallet or a wounded animal. She found 3 Marines, bound, bloodied, and left to die in the dark. And what came next wasn't justice. It was a miracle. This isn't just a story of survival. It's about a child who believed when no one else would, a dog who fought like he remembered the soul he was saving, and a God who still works through small hands and paw prints. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe God still sends angels with fur and 4 legs, hit subscribe, because this story won't just stay with you, it might change you. The wind whispered low through the narrow streets of Elm Ridge, a small town tucked into the cracked and quiet deserts of New Mexico. It was late autumn, and though the desert sun still scorched by day, the nights dipped into a surprising chill. The sky hung heavy with a purplish hue as dusk folded over the town, softening the edges of brick buildings and flickering neon shop signs. The cracked sidewalks were mostly empty now, save for the occasional passing pickup or someone locking up their store for the night. Emily Carter, 12 years old and built like a reed in the wind, pulled her faded hoodie tighter around her slight shoulders. Her messy, sun-bleached brown hair peeked out from beneath the hood, curling slightly at the tips from the lingering humidity. Her eyes, large, gray, observant, seemed to take in everything at once. There was a kind of stillness in Emily, not the kind born from fear, but from watching, waiting, and learning. She had grown up too fast, molded by long afternoons of silence while her mother worked double shifts, and shaped by the absence of a father whose name was rarely mentioned. At her side trotted Shadow, a German shepherd with a thick sable coat dusted with beige along his legs and snout. Shadow was large for his breed, nearly 90 pounds, and though his fur had dulled slightly with age, perhaps 5 or 6 years, his amber eyes burned bright with vigilance. His left ear bore a slight tear from an old fight, and his gait carried the quiet tension of an animal always half ready to spring. Emily had found him nearly starved behind the old diner 3 years prior, nursing a leg wound and growling at anyone who came near. She had approached slowly, whispering nonsense, and stayed until he let her sit beside him. Since that day, he hadn't left her side. They made a quiet pair, drifting like shadows themselves down Elm Ridge's east side. Emily clutched a small flashlight in one hand and a wrinkled paper bag in the other. She was heading to Miss Hilda's corner store, 5 blocks down, where the kind old shopkeeper had promised to save some unsold bread. Miss Hilda always wore sweaters 3 sizes too big and called everyone under 40 darling. She had a fondness for strays, animal and human alike. Emily's mother, Sarah Carter, had hesitated to let her daughter out after dark, but the fridge was near empty and the morning would offer little to eat. Sarah was a lean woman in her late 30s, with sharp cheekbones and calloused hands. Her dark hair was always pulled into a tight bun, a style born more from practicality than vanity. Once a bright student with dreams of becoming a nurse, Sarah had given it all up when her husband left, and Emily was only 2. Since then, she had become a house cleaner by day, a waitress by night, and someone whose quiet strength masked exhaustion. Her worry had been audible as she said, "Be careful, Em," and turned the lock behind her. Now, under the glow of dim streetlights, Emily and Shadow passed shuttered windows and the rustling of dry leaves. A few teenagers laughed loudly across the street, sitting on the hood of a rusted sedan. Emily paid them no mind, but Shadow kept his gaze fixed, ears twitching. The wind carried the scent of fried oil, gasoline, and something faintly metallic. As they neared the alley behind Cactus Pawn and Gun, Emily froze. A sound, a low grunt, then a thud. Shadow stopped too, his body lowering instinctively. Emily turned her head slowly toward the alley mouth, where the shadows folded into each other like layered smoke. There it was again, a moan. She hesitated, hearing her mother's voice in her mind. "Stick to the main streets, keep your head down." But the sound came again, clearer now, a voice choked in pain. It wasn't just one person. There were several figures, indistinct in the gloom. She took a trembling step forward. Shadow growled low in his throat, his body now rigid, alert. Emily clicked on her flashlight, its weak beam slicing through the darkness. She took another step. What she saw made her breath catch. 3 men, bound and slumped against the wall, hands tied behind their backs with coarse rope, faces bruised and swollen. Their uniforms, though tattered and dirtied, were unmistakable: United States Marines. And towering over them was a 4th man, his face partially hidden by a balaclava, steel-toed boots kicking one of the soldiers square in the ribs. Emily gasped audibly. The man turned. His frame was thick, almost bear-like, clad in a dark jacket with a faded patch on the shoulder. His eyes locked onto hers, cold, startled, then furious. "Get out of here, kid!" he barked, advancing a step. Shadow leapt in front of Emily, barking with primal rage, his teeth bared, his whole body rigid. The attacker flinched as the bark echoed, then raised a hand as if to strike. Emily found her voice. "Leave them alone!" she yelled, her voice cracking but firm. She aimed her flashlight beam directly at his face. He recoiled, cursing under his breath. The light caught the gleam of something in his hand. Was it a blade? Emily screamed, louder this time. "Help! Somebody help!" Voices in the distance stirred. The teenagers from the car, curious now. The attacker snarled, eyes flicking between Emily and the approaching noise. He turned and bolted into the far end of the alley, vanishing into the night. Emily didn't wait. She sprinted forward to the 3 men. One groaned, eyes fluttering open. Another's chest rose and fell with difficulty. "Shadow, stay close," she whispered. The dog obeyed but remained tense. She reached down and gently touched the shoulder of the nearest Marine. He was tall and square-jawed, even through bruises, maybe in his late 30s. His lips were cracked, his skin pale. "Sir, are you okay?" He blinked slowly. "Where are we?" "You're safe now. I'm getting help. Just hold on." She didn't know if that was true, but saying it made her feel braver. In the distance, a siren began to wail. The siren screamed louder, bouncing off the narrow alley walls as red and blue lights bathed the cracked bricks in color. Emily Carter's breath came in short bursts. Her small hands fumbled to retrieve her phone from the front pocket of her hoodie, nearly dropping it as she dialed. Her voice trembled, but she forced out the words. 3 men, beaten, tied up. Please, hurry." She gave the address, ending the call just as her flashlight beam flickered again. Shadow stood rigid beside her, teeth still bared, his growls now low and steady. His tail did not wag. This was not over. The scent of blood, sweat, and old leather filled the night air. Emily knelt beside the Marine who had briefly stirred, his eyes fluttering shut again. She had never been so close to someone so hurt. There was something terrifying in how still he was. The first man had a square face and a streak of gray at his temples beneath a battered helmet. His name tag, partly visible, read Reed. He looked to be in his late 30s, built like someone used to carrying burdens heavier than backpacks. His jaw was clenched even in unconsciousness. This was Sergeant Mason Reed, though Emily did not know that yet. To his left lay a man with darker skin, his lips split and bruised, and a long scar down one cheekbone. His uniform was torn at the shoulder, and dried blood streaked his left sleeve. His build was leaner, wirier, with long limbs and calloused knuckles. He was Logan Price, a corporal who had grown up defending his little sister from bullies in Detroit, which perhaps explained his quiet protectiveness even in sleep. The youngest of the trio was unmistakably new to battle. His gear was the cleanest, his boots the least scuffed, and his face, under the bruises, still held a trace of softness, of someone unprepared for this kind of pain. Jaden Clark, barely 21, had enlisted straight out of high school in Nebraska, where he once raised 4-H goats and 1 spelling bees. He now lay with his head tilted awkwardly, breathing shallow and rapid. Shadow leaned forward and began to nudge Jaden gently with his nose, whimpering softly. Then he licked the young man's cheek once, then again, tail twitching. Jaden stirred slightly and groaned. Shadow, encouraged, let out a short, sharp bark, then sat down next to the Marine's chest, keeping vigil. Emily turned at the sound of approaching footsteps. A pair of elderly voices echoed from the mouth of the alley. A man's low, "Is someone hurt?" was followed by a woman's gasp. Harold and Mabel Dawson, both in their 70s, were longtime residents of Elmridge. Harold, tall and slightly stooped, with a white mustache and a limp from an old mining accident, had once served in Korea and still wore his veteran cap every day. Mabel was shorter, round, always in floral blouses, and known for keeping lemon drops in her purse and warm biscuits for strays in her oven. "My God," Harold muttered, stepping forward but pausing as Shadow barked once at his advance. "Easy, boy." He held his hands up in a show of peace. Emily stood protectively over the Marines. "They need help," she said quickly. "Someone already called, but please, can you check on them? I don't know if they're breathing right." Mabel clutched her cardigan and nodded. "I'll call again, make sure they're coming." She pulled out a dated but functional flip phone. Meanwhile, Harold inched closer, speaking gently as he knelt beside Mason. "Still alive? Barely. This one needs oxygen. Fast." Emily moved to Logan, trying to remember something from school. Wasn't there a thing about head wounds? "Shadow," she whispered, "stay with him." Shadow obediently moved between Logan and Jaden, nose sniffing both like he was choosing who to tend first. He lay down beside Logan and rested his head on the Marine's leg. Minutes later, the flashing lights finally reached them. A police cruiser slid to a stop at the edge of the alley, its headlights slicing through the foggy dust. Two officers stepped out. One of them, a middle-aged man with a square jaw and neatly cropped blonde hair, identified himself as Officer Darnell Brooks. His partner, a younger woman with auburn curls, was Officer Rivera. Both were clearly shaken by what they found. Brooks approached with cautious urgency. "Everyone back, we've got this." He radioed in for backup, requesting EMTs with full trauma gear. Shadow stood as the officers moved in, his stance protective. He growled low, not threatening, just unwilling to budge. "It's okay," Emily said quickly, placing a hand on Shadow's back. "They're here to help." Her voice was hoarse. Shadow reluctantly stepped aside, but remained close, eyes fixed on the motionless bodies. The EMTs arrived moments later, two in Navy uniforms jumping from the ambulance with stretchers and medical kits. The lead medic was a tall, freckled woman named Teresa Nguyen, her black hair tied in a long braid. She spoke with calm authority, calling out vitals and directing the scene. Her partner, a stocky man with tired eyes and a kind voice, Marcus Hall, worked to cut through the ropes binding the Marines. Emily crouched beside Mason as Teresa fitted an oxygen mask to his face. His eyelids fluttered. "Please stay," Emily whispered, her hand slipping into his. "We found you. Don't go." She felt his fingers twitch faintly around hers. Rivera tried to usher Emily away, but she stood firm. "I won't move unless they're okay." Rivera hesitated, then softened. "You're braver than most adults I know." Teresa gave a thumbs up as the Marines were loaded one by one onto stretchers. "They'll make it, barely," she murmured. "But they're alive, thanks to this kid, and that dog." As the ambulances pulled away, Emily sat on the curb, her face pale, her hands shaking. Shadow came and rested his big head on her knee. She looked down at him and tried to smile. "You did good, boy," she murmured. "You stayed." The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air at St. Elmo's Regional Hospital, a modest but well-kept facility on the outskirts of Elmridge. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as nurses in pastel scrubs moved swiftly between rooms. Outside, a weak morning sun filtered through dusty blinds, casting pale strips of gold across the waiting area chairs. Autumn's bite still lingered in the air, and Emily Carter sat huddled in a seat too big for her, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her hoodie, twisting the fabric. Beside her sat Sarah Carter, her mother, whose presence felt both solid and strained. Sarah was a tall, slender woman in her late 30s, with olive-toned skin and fine lines etched around her mouth, more from fatigue than age. Her dark brown hair was pulled into its usual severe bun, though a few strands had slipped loose in the rush. She wore a faded denim jacket over a diner uniform and kept glancing toward the hallway as though willing someone to emerge with news. Her posture was tense, shoulders drawn up, as if bracing for something worse than what they already knew. Sarah had been called in as soon as the hospital got word that her daughter had discovered injured military personnel in an alleyway. A police officer had driven her in the middle of her second job shift at the Roadrunner Cafe, apron still tied at her waist. Upon hearing what Emily had done, she had hugged her daughter so tightly Emily thought her ribs might crack. But now, in the cold waiting room, that relief was fading into quiet worry. "Miss Carter?" A nurse appeared at the doorway, her voice soft. She was a petite woman in her 40s with gentle eyes behind square glasses and curly chestnut hair tucked into a ponytail. Her name tag read, Nurse Debbie Sloan. "Yes?" Sarah stood, placing a protective hand on Emily's shoulder. "They're stable," Nurse Sloan said, smiling. "All 3 men are in recovery. The doctors say it was close, but they'll be okay." Sarah exhaled in a gasp of gratitude. Emily looked up, wide-eyed. "Can we see them?" Nurse Sloan hesitated. "Well, one of them, Sergeant Mason Reed, regained consciousness, and he's asked specifically for a little girl and her German shepherd." She tilted her head with a grin. "I'm guessing that's you." Emily nodded shyly, her hand instinctively finding Shadow's collar. Shadow sat obediently at her feet, tail still but eyes alert. He looked clean, his fur brushed, though a bandage was wrapped lightly around one front paw, a scrape from the alley. A hospital volunteer had helped gently wipe him down and give him a small dish of water while Emily and Sarah waited. "I'll take you to him," Nurse Sloan said, leading them down a corridor with pale blue walls and the faint beep of monitors in every room. The recovery room was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of machines. Mason Reed lay propped up on a hospital bed, his right arm in a sling, an IV line snaking into his left hand. He was pale, with dark bruises across his cheekbone, and a small patch of his brown hair shaved for stitches. But his eyes, deep-set and steady, lit up the moment Emily and Shadow entered the room. "You're here," he murmured hoarsely, his voice rough from both injury and emotion. Emily approached slowly, unsure. Shadow padded beside her, sniffing the room, ears perked. Mason's lips curled into a shaky smile. "You brought the big guy, too. Good." Shadow moved first. With surprising gentleness, he stepped closer to the bed, placed his front paws on the edge, and nuzzled Mason's hand. Then, without hesitation, he licked Mason's face in one big, wet, unapologetic swipe. Mason let out a wheezing laugh, which turned into a wince. "Ow, but worth it." The room filled with quiet chuckles. Sarah smiled for the first time since arriving, and Nurse Sloan covered her mouth, stifling laughter. Emily looked down, face reddening. "Sorry about that. He's, affectionate." "No," Mason said, catching his breath. "He's perfect. You both are." He looked at Emily now, really looked, and what he saw wasn't just a child. It was someone who had stepped forward when others might have run. He gestured toward a chair. "Would you sit for a minute?" Emily did. Sarah remained near the door, respectful but close. "I don't remember everything," Mason said slowly, "but I remember the cold. I remember thinking this was it. Then, light. Your voice. His bark." Shadow now lay sprawled beside the bed, his head resting on one paw, but his eyes always on Emily. "I thought we were gone," Mason continued, blinking rapidly. "If not for you and your dog—" He paused, looked away for a breath, then leaned slightly closer. "You saved us, Emily," he whispered. "Me, my brothers. We owe you our lives." Emily's eyes welled unexpectedly. She bit her lip and looked away, but Mason saw the tears slip anyway. "I didn't think," she said quietly. "I just heard someone hurting." Mason reached out with his good hand and placed it gently over hers. His skin was rough, warm. "And that's what makes you a hero," he said. There was a pause. Then the door creaked open again. 2 men entered, Logan Price and Jaden Clark, each with bandages and hospital gowns under robes. Logan moved with a slight limp, his arm in a sling. Jaden, pale and young, leaned on a crutch, but smiled when he saw Emily. "That her?" Logan asked, his voice low and gravelly. "That's her," Mason confirmed. Jaden shuffled closer and offered Emily a hand to shake. "I'm Jaden," he said with a boyish grin. You really scared that guy off, huh?" Emily nodded, a smile breaking through her tears. Shadow helped. "We know," Logan said, kneeling to pet the dog. "He's a good soldier." Shadow gave a soft woof in reply. The air over Camp Wilcox carried the scent of warm sagebrush and grilled burgers as late afternoon sunlight spilled across the desert hills. Nestled on the edge of Elm Ridge, the military base was compact but well maintained. a mix of concrete barracks, chain-link fences, and a few well-tended green spaces that looked out of place among the dry soil and sandstone ridges of New Mexico. It was here, in a modest courtyard garden tucked between two training buildings, that Sergeant Mason Reed waited with a slight limp and a bouquet of wildflowers. Mason wore his pressed uniform jacket, though his left arm was still in a sling. The bruises along his jaw had faded into a deep plum tone, but he moved with more steadiness now. Behind his weathered face and military stiffness was a gentler energy today, one softened by something beyond duty. His dark brown hair was combed back, and a freshly polished Marine Corps pin gleamed on his chest. He turned when he heard the approaching voices. Emily Carter emerged from between the barracks, hand in hand with her mother, Sarah. Emily wore a denim skirt and a sky-blue t-shirt with faded sunflowers across the front. Her hair had been brushed neatly, though a few stubborn strands still curled at the temples. She looked excited but nervous, her eyes scanning everything around her with curiosity. Shadow, at her side, moved with his usual silent grace. His coat gleamed in the sun after a recent bath, and someone, likely a well-meaning soldier, had tied a small red bandana around his neck. Sarah followed, her features composed but alert. She had changed into a soft floral blouse and black slacks, her hair loose for once, cascading in gentle waves. Despite her calm demeanor, her eyes watched every movement near her daughter. Old instincts, sharpened by years of single motherhood, never truly rested. As they stepped into the courtyard, Sarah slowed and took in the small garden, a wooden picnic table, a few folding chairs, rows of cacti and lavender blooming along the stone path. "Hey there," Mason greeted, stepping forward. "You made it?" Emily smiled shyly. "Hi, Sergeant Mason." He chuckled. "You can call me Mason today. This isn't official. This is just friends having lunch." He handed her the bouquet. "For you." Emily's eyes widened. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he replied. They took their seats at the table, where a pair of younger Marines, Corporal Riley Nguyen and Specialist Mike Bennett, were already setting out paper plates and bottles of iced tea. Riley was a tall, athletic woman in her late 20s with a tight braid down her back and sun-kissed skin. She moved with the easy authority of someone used to giving orders. Mike, on the other hand, was stocky and freckled, with a gap-toothed smile and a perpetual smudge of engine grease on his hands from the base's motor pool. "Ma'am," Riley greeted Sarah politely, "we're honored to have you." Mike reached down to ruffle Shadow's head. "And there's the real hero." Shadow leaned into the touch with a low, contented huff. Lunch was simple: grilled chicken, coleslaw, fresh rolls, and apple pie Mason claimed was from a mess hall cook with secret bakery dreams. They ate in the garden's shade, laughter gradually replacing the tension Sarah had carried in with her. Between bites, Emily spoke about her love for animals, her dream of becoming a veterinarian, and how she had once rescued a three-legged cat named Biscuit from a storm drain. Mason listened with quiet interest, nodding, asking questions, treating her as an equal. Sarah watched, and for the first time in a long while, saw her daughter laugh with her whole face. After dessert, Mason stood, cleared his throat, and gave Riley a nod. She stepped away and returned moments later with something in her hands, a small wooden box. "We wanted to give you this," Mason said, placing it in front of Emily. She opened the lid and gasped. Inside was a Marine K-9 honorary medallion, the silver etched with an eagle and globe. Beneath it was a ribbon with the name Shadow, engraved on a small brass plate. "He saved lives," Mason said, "so we figured it was time someone gave him a uniform, too." Emily leaned down and wrapped her arms around Shadow's neck. The dog gave a soft bark and licked her ear. Everyone clapped. Then, just as the laughter peaked, a voice called out from the edge of the courtyard. "Sergeant Reed!" It was Lieutenant Armand Delgado, a tall, trim man in his early 40s with a shaved head, thick glasses, and a clipboard always under his arm. He walked with urgency, his boots striking the stone sharply. Mason stood at once. "Yes, sir?" Delgado's expression was grave. "You need to see this." He handed Mason a manila folder. Mason opened it, brows furrowing. His expression tightened. "What is it?" Sarah asked. Delgado looked to Mason for permission. Mason gave a slight nod. "There was a break-in," Delgado explained. "Last night. Your apartment." Sarah's hand flew to Emily's shoulder. Delgado continued. "It was targeted, The door wasn't forced, they had a key. Nothing was stolen, but Mason took a photo from the file and placed it on the table. It was a picture of a handwritten note, scrawled in thick black marker. Keep quiet, or else. Sarah went pale. Emily stared. We've already launched an investigation, Delgado assured. But this changes things. Emily's fingers curled into fists. Shadow stood, tail raised, his ears tilted back as if sensing the shift in atmosphere. Mason put a hand on her shoulder. You're safe here. We'll figure this out. But you both should stay on base tonight. Sarah nodded slowly. Agreed. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the warmth of the day slipped away, leaving behind only the dry rustle of wind and the creeping sense that danger had not yet passed. The secure housing quarters on the northern side of Camp Wilcox looked more like a quiet apartment complex than a military installation. The stucco buildings stood in uniform rows, painted in desert tones of beige and tan, with narrow paths lined by low cacti and patches of prickly pear. Despite the layers of fences and the armed gate posted with soldiers, there was a strange sense of stillness about the place, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Emily Carter sat cross-legged on the twin bed near the window, absently tracing a finger along the stitching of the bedspread. Her room, though temporary, had been made comfortable thanks to the efforts of several base staff. A soft quilt had been folded at the foot of the bed, and a small shelf held 3 borrowed library books and a framed photo someone had taken during the courtyard lunch. Emily and Shadow, beside Sergeant Mason, all 3 of them smiling. Shadow lay stretched out on the floor beside the bed, his ears alert even in rest. Though his eyes were half closed, he twitched at every outside sound. The click of boots, the rattle of wind against the screen, the occasional bark from the K-9 units in training. He was no longer just a companion. He had become her guardian in a world that suddenly seemed far more dangerous than she'd known. Sarah Carter had taken to sleeping on the couch in the living area just outside the room. Though offered a second bedroom, she had chosen proximity over comfort. Each night, she remained awake longer than she let on, her fingers wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug of herbal tea, eyes trained on the door as though it might open without warning. It had been 2 days since the break-in at their apartment. Lieutenant Armand Delgado had visited the next morning, dressed in his standard-issue uniform, his manner clipped but concerned. Delgado was a man with military precision embedded in his bones. His lean build, squared shoulders, and rigid jawline reflected years of leadership under pressure. Yet, beneath the strict posture was a man who had served with Mason Reed in more than one assignment and took loyalty seriously. The handwriting on the note matches a suspect we've been watching for months, he had said, laying out photos on the table. Images of coded shipments, encrypted emails, surveillance photos taken near Arizona state lines. We believe you were targeted not as a mistake, but as leverage. Sarah's face had hardened, a rare flicker of steel in her normally patient expression. Because she helped them? Delgado had nodded. Because she got in the way. Since that morning, the air inside their temporary home had grown heavier. Emily, normally resilient, had begun waking from nightmares. Each time she'd sit bolt upright in the bed, heart hammering, only to find Shadow already at her side, his head resting on her thigh or paw on her hand, as if he knew exactly what had startled her. I'm okay, she would whisper, more to herself than anyone else, and Shadow would simply stay, unmoving. On the 3rd evening, Sarah found Emily in the kitchen, standing on her toes to reach a box of cereal. Couldn't sleep? Sarah asked gently, stepping forward to help. Emily shook her head. Just hungry. Sarah poured a small bowl and handed it to her. I keep thinking about that note. So do I, Emily admitted. Do you think they will come again? Sarah looked at her daughter. Really looked. In her small frame and thoughtful eyes, she saw a child still, but one who had crossed a threshold too soon. No, she said, though her voice wasn't as firm as she wished. We're safer here. Emily sat quietly, slowly eating. Shadow sat by the door, facing outward, his body rigid. The next morning dawned bright and windless. Emily spent part of the day in the recreation room, reading one of her borrowed books about wolves. She liked them, their loyalty, their quiet strength, their sense of family. Shadow stayed pressed against her side the entire time. Later that afternoon, while Sarah was in a scheduled debrief with base security, Emily returned to the room and found a surprise: Sarah's old cell phone buzzing on the countertop. A call was coming through. Emily's brows furrowed. The screen read, Miss Hilda. A pang of warmth bloomed in her chest. Miss Hilda, the kind woman from the corner store with lemon drops and scratchy sweaters. The last time Emily had seen her, the older woman had pressed a bag of stale bread into her hands with a wink. She picked up the call. Hello? The voice on the other end was raspy, breathless. Emily, dear. Thank goodness. Miss Hilda? Emily asked, startled. Are you okay? I fell, the voice wheezed. Behind the shop, my leg. I think it's broken. Emily's heart raced. Did you call an ambulance? I tried, the woman said quickly, but my phone died. You were the only number I could reach before it cut out. Please, sweetheart, come quick. I'm just behind the alley. Don't tell your mama. She's been through enough already. The line crackled and went dead. Emily stared at the phone. Shadow growled low. She looked at him. She's in trouble. Shadow growled again, deeper this time, and stood in front of the door. When Emily moved to grab her jacket, he blocked her. What's wrong? She asked, trying to push past him. It's just Miss Hilda. Shadow barked sharply, once, then again, urgent, forceful. His body blocked the entrance like a wall. Shadow, she said, shocked. Move! But he wouldn't. The dog's eyes held something more than fear. They held warning. Emily hesitated. She glanced back at the phone, then at the door, then back at Shadow. Eventually, her concern for Miss Hilda won out. She crouched and whispered, I'll be right back. She needs help. Then she slipped past him. Shadow whined, then raced to the window, paws against the sill, watching as Emily jogged toward the pedestrian gate. Outside the fence, the world looked normal. Sun on pavement, wind in the weeds. But to Shadow, something was wrong. His hackles stood. His tail straightened. And then, Emily vanished around the corner of the outer wall. Shadow barked once, twice, but she didn't return. The van's interior was dark, the windows blacked out, and the air reeked of gasoline and something more pungent. Sweat and fear. Emily Carter sat on the cold metal floor, her wrists bound behind her with zip ties that cut sharply into her skin. A gag had been stuffed roughly into her mouth, but she'd managed to loosen it enough to spit it out when no one was watching. Her knees were scraped, her ankle bruised from being shoved inside, and her breathing came in short, ragged bursts. She stared into the darkness, trying to stay calm, trying to think. The man across from her, hunched on a crate, was large and broad-shouldered, dressed in all black, with a faded tattoo curling around the base of his neck. His name was Dylan Hart, though Emily didn't know that yet. He had thick, greasy hair tied back into a stubby ponytail, and a crooked nose that looked like it had been broken more than once. His left leg bore a noticeable limp, the same man she had seen fleeing that alley. The same man who had kicked Mason Reed while he lay helpless. Dylan didn't speak. He barely looked at her. He just chewed on the inside of his cheek, checking his cracked watch over and over. The driver was younger, thinner, his face obscured by a baseball cap and mirrored sunglasses. Emily caught glimpses of a nervous tick in his fingers, always tapping, drumming, twitching. He muttered under his breath, lines she couldn't make out. The van rattled as it turned off the road and into gravel. Emily felt the tires crunch under them. The vehicle slowed and came to a jarring halt. "We're here," the driver said. Dylan opened the back doors and yanked her out with one powerful arm. Emily stumbled onto the ground, knees buckling. Before her stood an old warehouse, once used for storage, now boarded up, abandoned, and forgotten, at the edge of Elmridge's industrial zone. Weeds curled up between the concrete slabs, and rust streaked the corrugated metal walls like dried blood. They dragged her inside. The air inside was thick with dust and dampness. Faint beams of light filtered through gaps in the tin roof, casting sharp silver lines across the wooden floor. Old pallets, shattered crates, and torn plastic tarps littered the place. The space smelled of mold, rust, and motor oil. They tied her to a metal chair in the center of the warehouse floor. Rope scratched at her arms, coarse and dry. One loop went across her chest, pinning her back. Her wrists were bound tight behind her again. She bit down the urge to cry. Instead, she focused on her breathing. In out. Then, as Dylan stepped away, she did something quietly, almost instinctively. She leaned slightly to one side and shifted a small object out of her pocket with the tips of her fingers. It was the keychain, a tiny metal tag with Shadow engraved on it in block letters. She twisted and wedged it between the ropes in her thigh. If they found it, they might toss it. But if Shadow found it, she had to believe he would. Outside, the desert wind blew dust across the warehouse siding. Somewhere, far off, a hawk screeched. Back at Camp Wilcox, the world had already begun to realize Emily was missing. Sarah Carter had returned to the apartment from her debriefing and found the room empty. The door unlocked. Shadow paced in circles by the window, whining, ears pinned back. He barked once, then again, and when Sarah opened the door to the hallway, he bolted out, nose to the ground. Sarah didn't hesitate. She ran after him, barefoot, panic rising in her throat. She shouted for help, and 2 patrolling MPs sprinted to her side within seconds. It wasn't long before Lieutenant Delgado arrived, grim-faced and already pulling up satellite maps on his tablet. "She wouldn't leave without telling someone," Sarah said breathlessly. "She didn't," Delgado confirmed. "Someone called her. We traced a number, spoofed to match a contact. We're checking street cameras. That dog," he nodded to Shadow, who was pawing the gate and barking like mad, "might be our best lead." Meanwhile, in the warehouse, Dylan paced the floor while the younger man leaned against the wall, chewing gum and looking twitchy. "She's just a kid," the driver muttered. "We can still let her go." Dylan didn't answer. His jaw worked, grinding teeth. He looked at Emily, whose eyes hadn't left his since the gag had come loose. She wasn't crying. That bothered him more than if she had. "You should have stayed out of it," he said finally. "All you had to do was walk by." She didn't reply. He stepped closer. "You think you're brave, huh? Think you're gonna get a medal or something?" Still, nothing. "You think that dog of yours is gonna show up like some hero?" he growled. Emily blinked once, then smiled. Barely. That was when Shadow found the scent. He had bolted across the base, past the motor pool, and down the west fence line. A patrol jeep followed behind him, trying to keep up. Shadow's body was low and fast, nose dragging, paws churning the dusty earth. He darted left at a chain-link gate, scaled it in seconds, and landed running on the other side. By the time Mason Reed and Delgado jumped into the lead SUV, the dog was already half a mile down Highway 9, streaking toward the warehouses near the train tracks. In the warehouse, Emily had started working the ropes behind her. She twisted her wrists as hard as she could, ignoring the bite of the fibers. She reached the little tag and gripped it between thumb and finger. The edges were jagged from wear. She began to saw, slowly, quietly. Dylan's back was turned. The younger man stood near the entrance, distracted by a vibration on his phone, and then the door slammed open. Shadow hurled through the gap like a bullet, a blur of fur and fury. He hit Dylan square in the back, knocking the man to the floor. The older man shouted, grappling with the dog, but Shadow was relentless, snarling, clawing, teeth sunk into Dylan's jacket sleeve. The driver yelped and bolted. Outside, the sound of sirens rose, several vehicles screeching to a halt. Dylan shoved Shadow off and reached for a blade, but too late. Mason was there, tackling him to the ground. Emily let out a cry, sharp and hoarse, as Shadow ran to her side. Mason barked orders. Delgado stormed in behind, cuffing the younger man trying to flee through the back exit. Police lights bathed the interior in red and blue. Shadow whined and pressed his head against Emily's knee as Mason cut her ropes. "You're safe now," he said softly. The red and blue lights still pulsed across the rusted siding of the warehouse, flickering like a heartbeat in the dark. Police cruisers, military jeeps, and unmarked tactical vehicles now surrounded the building, engines still running, radios crackling with clipped commands. The night had deepened into a quiet, eerie calm, but inside the warehouse, the echoes of chaos still lingered. Sergeant Mason Reed stood just inside the door, one arm pressed tightly to his bleeding shoulder, his other hand clutching his sidearm. His face was pale, but his eyes remained clear, locked on the little girl huddled against the metal chair. Emily Carter sat still, frozen in place, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. The ropes that had bound her were now sliced clean, and Shadow stood beside her, still snarling low in his throat, his teeth bared in the direction of Dylan Hart. the man now cuffed and face down on the floor. Mason took a step forward. Pain lanced through his arm, but he ignored it. "Emily," he said, voice low and gentle, "you're safe now." Her eyes darted to him. For a second, she didn't move. Then, like a dam breaking, she ran, straight into his arms. The movement jolted his injured shoulder, but Mason didn't flinch. He dropped to one knee, wincing, and wrapped his good arm around her as tightly as he could. Emily buried her face against his chest, sobbing without words. Shadow let out a relieved bark and began licking her cheeks frantically, tail wagging, nose pushing between them as if to make absolutely sure she was whole. He circled once, then leaned into Mason's good side, his body trembling from adrenaline and effort. Behind them, Lieutenant Delgado entered with several armed officers. His face was carved in stone, eyes scanning the room. 2 men had already taken the driver into custody, and another squad was moving into the back office where computer equipment had been hastily abandoned. Delgado's gaze narrowed as he spotted one particular face among the detained. A man wearing civilian clothes, but with military boots and a tattoo just barely peeking out from beneath his collar. "Clint Rowe," Delgado muttered under his breath. Clint had once served under Mason during their deployment to Kandahar. Blonde, lean, and sharp-tongued, he had been known for his mechanical skills and a keen strategic mind, but also for bending rules until they snapped. Mason had vouched for him once, years ago. Now, that same man stood in cuffs, flanked by 2 MPs. "You always did have a hero complex," Clint said coldly, blood trickling from a cut on his brow. "Should have stayed out of this." Mason's expression didn't change. "And you should have remembered who you were before the money." Delgado approached slowly, nodding toward the medics who had begun to enter with stretchers. "We found evidence in the back office. Emails, maps, surveillance footage. You've just put a very big dent in their entire network." But Mason barely heard him. His focus was on Emily, who had quieted in his arms. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded against his chest. "You're bleeding," she whispered. He smiled, grim but warm. "Just a scratch." Sarah Carter arrived moments later. Her usually calm, composed face was flushed, her hair loose from the ponytail she'd tied it in earlier, her blouse wrinkled. She pushed past the perimeter of soldiers, calling out once, "Emily!" And when her daughter turned, they both ran into each other's arms. The reunion was raw and immediate. Amelia dropped to her knees and held her daughter like she'd never let go again, whispering over and over, "I've got you, I've got you." Emily clung to her, sobbing freely now. Shadow pressed against both of them, whining softly. One of the officers approached Mason, holding a field bandage. "Sir, you're bleeding out. We've got to get that treated." But Mason only shook his head. "Tend to the kid first." The medic gave him a look but complied, kneeling beside Emily and checking her vitals. She was bruised, scraped, dehydrated, but alive and strong. Meanwhile, Delgado stepped closer to Mason and gestured to the detained soldiers. "We'll need you to give a statement about Rowe. This ties back into the arms case. He's the inside man." Mason gave a slight nod, then winced. The adrenaline was wearing off. "You should sit down," Delgado said more seriously. "That's not a scratch." Mason finally relented, lowering himself onto a crate. Blood seeped through his uniform sleeve in a steady drip, and the field medic began to cut away the fabric to clean the wound. Emily broke away from her mother just long enough to approach him again. "Why did you do that?" she asked, pointing at the blood. Mason looked down at her, then gave her a tired smile. "Because I owed you one." She frowned. "But you could have—" "Hey," he interrupted gently, "you ran into a dark alley to help people you didn't know. You didn't think twice. That's the bravest thing I've ever seen. If someone's going to take a bullet for anyone tonight, it ought to be me." She blinked back new tears, then suddenly lunged forward and wrapped her arms around his uninjured side. Mason hesitated, then hugged her back, careful not to jostle the gauze on his shoulder. Nearby, Delgado gave a small, approving nod. "We'll get them all," he said quietly. "You bought us enough time." Shadow curled up beside Mason's feet, finally at rest. The German shepherd's chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, but his eyes remained fixed on Emily, watching, guarding. Later, as Emily was being escorted back to the base in a separate vehicle, she glanced down at the little tag still clutched in her hand. It was bent now, covered in grime, but the name Shadow still shimmered faintly beneath the dust. She reached down and stroked his ears. "You found me," she whispered. Shadow thumped his tail once and leaned into her touch. The sun broke gently over the horizon, spilling light across the sandstone ridges of Elm Ridge, New Mexico. That morning, the desert air was cooler than usual, softened by the overnight wind. Rows of white folding chairs had been carefully arranged in the open courtyard of the new facility on the north end of town, where an old shipping yard had been transformed into something that shimmered with purpose. A modest sign, painted in bold navy and warm gold, swung lightly in the breeze. Emily and Shadow Hope Center. The newly renovated complex was a mix of red brick and steel, modern but warm. A long ramp led into the main training hall, flanked by flower beds filled with desert marigolds, blue flax, and clusters of lavender. Inside were polished floors, classrooms with colorful murals, and fenced outdoor spaces for canine training. It didn't look like a government facility. It looked like a sanctuary. Emily Carter, now 13 and a little taller than she had been just a few months ago, stood in front of the gathered crowd. She wore a simple white dress with soft yellow stripes, and her dark hair was braided down one shoulder. At her side, as always, was Shadow, his black and tan coat brushed to a shine, a silk blue bandana tied around his neck, and a shiny honorary badge clipped to his collar that read, "Lead K-9 Instructor." He looked regal, alert, yet calm, his ears twitching as the crowd shifted and murmured. Behind Emily, a stage had been set up with a microphone, and a red ribbon stretched across the entrance of the center. Standing beside her was Sergeant Mason Reed, his left arm now free of the sling, though the scar beneath his uniform sleeve remained fresh. He had traded his combat boots for polished dress shoes, and for once, a small lapel pin in the shape of a paw print glittered proudly on his chest. To his other side stood Sarah Carter, tall and graceful in a light gray blouse and tailored slacks. Her face was radiant with pride, though her hand never left Emily's shoulder. The pain of past loss had carved shadows into her eyes, but the warmth in her gaze today came from a place of deep healing. She had worked tirelessly with the city council, funders, and veterans groups to make this day possible. The mayor of Elm Ridge, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s named Harold Granger, stepped to the microphone first. His thick mustache quivered slightly as he smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I have lived in this town for 40 years. I've seen storms, droughts, and the best and worst of humanity. But nothing prepared me for the bravery of a 12-year-old girl and a stray dog who decided that silence in the face of danger was not an option." The crowd clapped. Emily blushed, and Shadow gave a low wag of his tail. Mayor Granger continued, "Thanks to the efforts of Sergeant Mason Reed, our partners at Fort Clearwater, and the generosity of several private donors, we are proud to open the Emily and Shadow Hope Center, a place that will provide training for search and rescue dogs, and more importantly, shelter and education for at-risk children. Because courage," he paused, "is not something you're born with. It's something that rises inside you, especially when someone else needs saving." He stepped back, motioning for Emily to approach the microphone. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she walked forward. She looked out over the faces, neighbors, soldiers, teachers, and even a few children already enrolled in the center, all watching her. She cleared her throat. "I don't really like speaking in front of people," she began, and the audience chuckled softly. "But I want to tell you something." She paused, her fingers grazing Shadow's head. "I didn't save anyone by myself. I'm not a superhero. I'm just a kid who had a heart, and a dog who didn't leave me, even when it was scary." Her voice caught slightly, but she pressed on. "This place is for kids like me, who need someone, or maybe need a dog. It's also for dogs who need a job, or a second chance, just like Shadow." Applause broke out, and Mason stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. Together they held a pair of golden scissors, and Emily cut the ribbon, officially opening the doors. The crowd rose to their feet. Cameras flashed. Shadow barked once, loud and proud, and the sound echoed through the courtyard like a trumpet of hope. Later that afternoon, as guests toured the facility, Emily led a group of local kids through the play yard where several young dogs were being trained by volunteers. One dog, a golden retriever with a crooked ear named Biscuit, was chasing a tennis ball with wild enthusiasm, while a smaller mutt named Maple sat patiently beside a boy, learning to give basic commands. Mason, meanwhile, spoke with a woman in uniform, Captain Riley Nguyen, recently transferred to Elmridge's military liaison unit. She was tall and composed, with sharp cheekbones and hair pulled tightly into a bun. Her voice was firm but warm. "I've reviewed your full after-action report," she said to Mason. "It's unusual for a soldier to start a civilian project so soon after an operation like that." "It wasn't about me," Mason replied, eyes following Emily across the field. "It was about finishing what she started." Riley nodded. "Well, if you ever want this model duplicated at another base, let me know. We need more places like this." Back near the mural wall, Sarah Carter sat on a bench, watching her daughter laugh with a group of children, Shadow prancing at their feet. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to close her eyes for a moment, letting the sun warm her face, knowing her child was safe. Her town was healing, and something good had come from something terrible. That evening, as the last guests left and the center began to quiet down, Emily stood in the middle of the training yard, looking at the stars slowly waking up above the desert. Shadow lay beside her, panting softly. "You know," she whispered, "we're just getting started." Shadow let out a soft, approving grunt, then rested his head on her feet. Sometimes, miracles don't come with wings or thunder. Sometimes, they come in the form of a child's courage and a loyal dog's bark. Emily and Shadow reminded us that even in the darkest alley, light can still find its way, through innocence, through loyalty, and through love. Perhaps God still speaks, not with words, but through paw prints and the quiet strength of a heart that refuses to give up. In a world that often forgets the small and the broken, this story is a gentle reminder that no act of love goes unseen by heaven. If you believe that angels can walk on four legs, and that even a child can change the fate of others, then this story was meant for you. May God bless you for watching. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Leave a comment below and type Amen if you believe God still works through the unexpected. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next miracle. Stay kind, stay faithful, and never stop believing in second chances.